I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
And I'm Matt Bernico. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
We've been talking about non-Marxist communism for a little while. So we've been through the Diggers and Thomas Müntzer, these kind of like proto-communist figures, and then we did some episodes about the early church and communism of consumption. And then last week we talked about Jose Miranda's Communism in the Bible, and we weren't really planning on this, but it's kind of built up to a trajectory, I think, to this episode, where we can do sort of the opposite and talk about explicitly Marxist contributions to communism and maybe think a little bit about why Christians should care about that.
Yeah, exactly. Seems like we got to do it, We spent so long talking about people who don't know about Marx, so we got to ramp it up. So it's about time we got to it, to this world historic event. That's a Marxism joke. So to do that, we read Eric Hobsbawm's book. It's like a book of essays, a collection of essays called How to Change the World. Basically, this is a book that's just full of history stuff, and it's kind of boring. It's fine. It's cool if you like Marx, and I do, so it was great. We paid some special attention to some sections he wrote about the communisms that preceded Marx in Europe, like directly before Marx, not the ones we've been talking about for the last few weeks. And we also read a little bit about the history behind the Communist Manifesto, and there's a bunch of it. I've read the Communist Manifesto, a gazillion times, but finding the history behind it was kind of cool. It made me think about some things in it a little bit differently.
Yeah, Eric Hobsbawm is really interesting for a lot of reasons. He is probably the most famous Marxist historian in the English-speaking world probably ever. I think that's fair to say. He's a British guy. He wrote a bunch of history books, but he also was a communist himself. And that's a pretty big deal because he is pretty widely respected even outside of communist circles as a historian. So this book's really interesting because he's sort of reflecting on the history of a tradition that he is part of, both theoretically and politically. So hopefully we'll get some good stuff out of that. And to set the stage a little bit, we'll maybe start out with this word from Jose Miranda from last week. So we talked about this take where he said this at the very beginning of the book. He says, "For a Christian to say that he or she is anti-Marxist is understandable. There are numerous varieties of Marxism, and it's possible that our Christian is referring to one of the many materialistic philosophies which style themselves as Marxist without having much at all to do with Marx. But for a Christian to claim to be anti-communist is quite a different matter, and without doubt constitutes the greater scandal." So the point that he's trying to make there is that there's a communism that's separate from Marx, and you should separate Marxism from Marxists as well, or Karl Marx anyway, from Marxists. And I think that both of those things are true, but also there are some good reasons for Christians to not only not be afraid of Marxism, but maybe to even get into it to be Marxist, or at least think about Marxist philosophy a little more.
Yeah, I think so. Last week, the sort of conclusion of our conversation was, the communisms of consumption, as we've been calling them, because of Rosa Luxemburg, they are, not bad. In fact, they're good parts of our like Christian memory that we might want to recall more often than we do. But Marxism is also good. So like, why not just have it all? Just take it all.
Yeah. Let's get into that in just a second. But before we do that, we don't have any iTunes reviews, but we did both experience a pretty historic artistic event this week. The film Sorry to Bother You by Boots Riley. And we're not going to give any spoilers. It's very important that you don't read any spoilers. If you've managed to escape them already, do yourself a favor and don't go find them. But that being said, Matt, hot take. What do you think? Sorry to Bother You, a good communist movie by a real life actual communist.
The best communist movie, the best movie just in general. It's so good.
It is so good. It's super fun.
It is very funny and very critical, and does a lot of the work that I think Marx does in the movie.
It's wild, I'll say that much. I took my doctoral advisor there, who is like a lefty guy, a socialist he would say, I think, but definitely not a communist, and I still am not exactly sure what he made of it, but he was a good sport about it, so that's cool. My wife went, she was really into it. Today she was texting me sorry to bother you gifts and complaining about her job, so it's really working out. I think
the movie has so many just like great little just like pieces of, I don't know, Marxist critique, communist critique in it, and you got to go see this movie. Can we just talk for like 1 second though how absolutely buck wild it is that there's an actual communist movie that you can go to the movie theater and see?
Yeah, it is insane.
Like, I paid like $7 and I got to see like a actual communist movie in a movie theater with like 10 other people. I went like at 2:00 this afternoon, so there weren't very many other people, but you get it. It's crazy. Yeah. Crazy that could be a thing that happens in 2018, the year of our Lord. That communist movie.
I love it. I feel like probably, so the movie's very good and people should go see it. But the biggest thing I think that I'm appreciating about it is that it's giving Boots Riley a big platform, and he's going on a bunch of talk shows. He was on like CBS talking about the movie, which is totally absurd to me and very cool. And it's just insane that there's a communist talking about communism on CBS. That's really great. Also, he's had a really good Twitter presence. I mean, mostly he's just retweeting people who love his movie, and that's fine. But there's some really good, like, little comments he's made. Like, someone was like, "This is the movie we need in the Trump administration," and he's like, "Yeah, but like, also I wrote it under Barack Obama's administration, so the material conditions haven't changed." So I really appreciate that perspective getting a little more play.
Yeah, for sure. I even heard him on NPR a few weeks ago talking about the movie, and I don't remember who was interviewing him. One of the famous NPR types, and it was so funny to hear them try to articulate what the movie was about. And he was like, "Yeah, I mean, it's about capitalism being bad and stuff." And there's like, okay, but let's talk more about that white person voice in the film. Like, like really wanting to draw on the scandal sort of racism and play that up. While it's like a huge part of the movie and it's super important, but like it's also a movie that's anti-capitalist in an important way too, right? They want to talk about one but not the other, and so it's a funny thing.
Also, Boots Riley is basically the reason I became a communist, because I got a hold of a couple of albums when I was in an evangelical school and just couldn't beat those fat beats,
Nah, man, they're good.
So I appreciate that. Good personal connection. Anyway, if you haven't seen the movie, you should see it. If you haven't listened to The Coup, which is the rap outfit that Boots Riley is part of, you should do that. And I'm going to go see it again. So spend money to help communists pay their bills.
Dean, do you remember, okay, this is a weird callback, but maybe in your past evangelical life, you'll remember this kind of thing happening. When the film Passion of the Christ came out, it was like a moral imperative for Christians everywhere to go see it at the first, like when it opened, so it would make like huge box office numbers. And I remember when I was like, I don't know, a teenager when that came out or whatever, I was like, man, that kind of seems like a weird thing to do. I mean, it's a Christian movie about Jesus, but I feel like kind of weird about that, like trying to inflate the box office numbers. Like, people should just go see it. But in this one instance here, I think it's very good. Get those box office numbers way up and make people know that communism is very profitable, I guess.
I agree. The fact of the matter is, Mel Gibson is a bad director and Boots Riley is a great director. And sorry to bother you.
It's just different,
It's the Passion of the Christ for communists, so you've got to go see it. The Passion
have
of the
to. You
Communist
have
is
to
what
go
it
see
should have
it.
been called. So
Bring your small group. Take your pastor.
yeah, that's right. All right, cool. Well, we did it. We did the free plug. That's well deserved. And now let's talk about Marx. So this book by Eric Hobsbawm, How to Change the World. Bad manual, bad title for the book. You're not going to learn how to change the world, but you are going to learn about how Marx wanted you to change the world.
You're going to learn about 30 weird French and German guys who Marx did not like. That's what you're going to learn.
Yeah, that's right. It is very dry reading, but really useful and interesting, and hopefully we'll pull out some of the stuff so that you don't have to slog through it if you don't want to, and still get all the good stuff. So in the beginning, he opens the book with this essay called Marx Today, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I think there's a lot to be said about it, but probably one of the biggest things that struck me was a fact that he sort of opens up with. So he says, 70 years after Marx's death, 1/3 of the human race lived under regimes ruled by communist parties which claimed to represent his ideas and realize his aspirations. Well over 20% of people still do, though their ruling parties have, with minor exceptions, dramatically changed their policies. In short, if one thinker left a major indelible mark on the 20th century, it was he. So I think that is at least a good historical precedent for talking about what Marx actually thought, because while non-Marxist communists do exist and non-Marxist communism does exist, it was Marxist communism for sure that made, I think, the biggest impression, inarguably, of any of those communist movements.
So it's important for that reason. It's also the case, too, that just like Marx is important, again, because as soon as economic precarity kind of rears its head, like it did in 2008 and before that even, people start caring about Marx again, right? So he's popular for a lot of reasons. Marx is popular again. Wolf Howl.
Yeah, Wolf Howl, indeed. Just saying Wolf Howl, it's sort of, I feel like it should take the wind out of the sails, but actually doesn't. It makes me ponder it a little bit more, so I appreciate that. I think, too, it's just useful to articulate the fact that Marx and Marxists did actually change the world and change history. I mean, people can be upset about it if they want, and that's fair and fine, I guess. But there's no denying that, like, the kind of communism that, for example, Jose Miranda is talking about in the Bible, which is, like, very cool, still didn't end up creating communist societies in the same way that Marxism did. So paying attention to those strategies and analytic tools, I think, it should at least give us pause to be like, all right, maybe there's something here. If you're sour about Marx, well, proof's in the pudding in a certain way.
Yeah, I think so. Though, that being said, Eric Hobsbawm does have... Okay, so it is true. Marx and like the sort of communist parties and other sort of iterations of sort of Marxist thought in actually existing politics has made a huge impact everywhere. Hobsbawm, for some reason, I don't know, probably something to be made of this, but is really... really only interested in, for some reason, the Bolsheviks. Like, that's kind of like his big thing. There's a part even in the first few chapters where he says, what is the relevance of Marx in the 21st century? The Soviet-type model of socialism, the only attempt to build a socialist economy so far, no longer exists. On the other hand, there has been an enormous and accelerating progress of globalization and so on. Whatever. I guess it just bugs me because, like, that's true. The Soviet-type model of socialism does not exist, but there's plenty of other sort of, like, actually existing socialism in the world that we should probably think about. I mean, it is, I think, undeniable that the Soviet Union had, a huge impact on sort of the global scene. But, other countries are important, too.
For sure. No, I think that's exactly right, and he really does a disservice, I think, throughout the whole book, actually not talking about lots of other communist struggles elsewhere. It's really weird. I mean, he's a European historian, so I guess in terms of expertise that makes sense, but by virtue of being an actual communist person, it doesn't make sense, because, like, you should know a little bit more about Cuba or, like, Maoism in the Philippines or something than he lets on.
Right. I mean, like, Soviet-type model socialism was a big deal. But it's gone and Cuba's still around, so maybe we should think about that for a second.
Yeah, exactly. There's lots of like complicated things happening, I think, throughout Hobsbawm's analysis, and as we go, I think that will be a theme that comes through, is that, like, all right, we're trying to make a case in this episode that you should care about Marx and Marxism, But one thing that Hobsbawm shows, even trying to prove that, is that Marx and Marxism are really plural, like really multiple. And it's not like, it isn't the case that you can just go to Marx and be like, oh, that's just what everyone should think, like good Marxist fundamentalists.
Yeah, that is definitely true, Dean. That is that is an extremely heterodox and very postmodern take on Marxism. But it's right. But
I don't know.
Eric
Eric Hobsbawm says that it's true, and he is anything but those two things.
Yeah. Well, that's fine.
Yeah.
Nobody tell anyone else that cares.
Yeah, we gotta shut this episode down. All right, but I will say, though, this essay, before we kind of move on to some other chapters, I think does have a really good point, where he says, Hobsbawm writes, Marx himself deliberately abstained from specific statements about the economics and economic institutions of socialism, and said nothing about the concrete shape of communist society, except that it could not be constructed or programmed, but would evolve out of a socialist society. That's a pretty bold claim to make. I mean, he's really trying to drive home the fact that there's a real eschatological force behind Marx. And that might come as a surprise for people who are familiar with the Marx of, say, like a book like Capital, which is just full of lots and lots of programmatic ideas and things. But I think that that's actually a good thing to kind of insist on, that Marx does sort of open a window, and there's lots of ways to look out of that window.
Yeah, I actually have a really hard time with this bit, kind of for the reason you just said. But okay, there's a thing I like about it. There's a thing I don't like about it so much. And first of all, I'll say the thing I like about it. What I like about Hobsbawm's point here, I guess about Marx, is that like the Marx that we get in terms of like actually existing Soviet model socialism is kind of different than the Marx that we might read in the Communist Manifesto, right? It's like a specific interpretation of Marx's work elsewhere. And Hobsbawm's point that like Marx doesn't write out a program for communism or something is kind of right, I guess, in a way, in the sense that like he doesn't have like a 5-year plan or something. I have a hard time with it because the Communist Manifesto does have some like programmatic elements in it, and I think that's a tension that he just like doesn't really deal with at all. So in a later section, I guess I'll talk about this a bit more. In a later section, Hobsbawm goes on to say that, like, to take an obvious example, the Communist Party, whose manifesto our text claimed to be, had nothing to do with the parties of modern democratic politics or the vanguard parties of Leninist communism, let alone the state parties of the Soviet and Chinese type. None of these yet have existed. That makes complete sense. And then Hobsbawm even goes on to say, party still meant essentially a tendency or current of opinion or policy, although Marx and Engels recognized that once this found expression in class movements, it developed into some kind of organization. And then he continues to say, as the text made clear, Marx and Engels' Communist Party at this stage was no kind of organization, nor did it attempt to establish one, let alone an organization with a specific program distinct from other organizations. Incidentally, the actual body on whose behalf the manifesto is written, the Communist League, is nowhere mentioned in it. Okay, so the whole point here is kind of okay, but has some difficulties, I think, or some tensions that we should probably talk about and draw out here with Hobsbawm. In one sense, like, it's true, like, when the elaboration on like what the word party means is kind of like interesting and helpful. Like, vanguard parties didn't exist. Lenin wasn't, there on the scene. But still in the manifesto, there are actually there's 10 points that Marx lays out that's kind of a programmatic sort of thing. So I find some of this kind of hard to deal with. Like, Marx lays out 10 things he wants people to do, sort of, to move towards socialism, and they are pretty programmatic things. They range from really kind of abstract ideas, or ideas with no sort of implementable plan, like the abolition of private property. He doesn't say how to, but then they get way more specific when he talks about the centralization of credit and the centralization of the means of communication. He kind of gets more concrete as things go on. So I guess there's just kind of a tension here in the way Hobsbawm presents it and the way Marx writes it. It's hard to know exactly what Marx thought about these things, other than they should be done, but we don't necessarily know how. So it's kind of a weird thing, kind of a weird document.
Yeah, I think that you're right. It's true that there are programmatic things in the Communist Manifesto. I think the main thing that Hobsbawm's trying to drive home is that there isn't a completely obvious link between what's said in the manifesto, for example, and what happens in like the Bolshevik Revolution or in Mao's China or something like that. Like those kinds of programs aren't laid out in the manifesto exactly. It's clear that there's a link there. It's not to say that, you know, Hobsbawm is a Bolshevik. Like, he's definitely not being like, these are disingenuous or like, you know, bad deformations or whatever, but I think he's just trying to suggest that the manifesto itself and what's happening in early kind of Communist Party movements that Marx and Engels are part of isn't a straight line, and that there are a lot of points of radiation out from that. I guess I sort of think this is a really good example of how, again, like we said on the podcast before, a lot of things that happen on the left mirror what happened in Christianity, right? So, you know, Christians have this kind of sacred text, and it says a lot of really definitive things, and it also leaves a lot of wiggle room for a lot of other things, and that creates all kinds of arguments and disagreements about strategy and about how a Christian movement should look and what it should think and all those sorts of things. And I think that Marxism and Marxist communism is a very good mirror of that. So you get lots and lots of definitive statements. You know, it's not like completely and entirely open with no program. And it's true that Hobsbawm is maybe playing a little too loose and fast there. But I think there's the point that there's just like a lot of room is an important one to kind of insist on.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There is a lot of room. I mean, when Marx, like right before Marx says those things in the manifesto, he says like, these are the things that the most advanced countries
Right.
should do or something. So I guess like that's fine. That's a fine tension for me to live in. I don't mind that at all. I guess it just bugs me when it's like, well, there's no specific program here, and like, but there's 10 points.
That's completely fair.
So
true.
So fine, but fine. I get it.
No, I think you're right though.
Okay, I mean, even though I'm annoyed and like, fine. I don't know. I wouldn't be like a Marxist who are not annoyed by like really pedantic things like this. But like it is kind of a cool and helpful thing to draw out though, that like the Marxism of Lenin or the Marxism of like, I don't know, like autonomia or whatever, right? Like they're Marxisms that are drastically different and like some different takes and different emphases on different parts of the young Marx and the old Marx and everything else, you know. So that's cool. I'm into that.
They're, I mean, in a real and important way, they are like hermeneutic projects, right? Like they are interpretive efforts that have to be made, because you can't just hold up the Communist Manifesto in Russia, you know, and be like, this is what we're doing right now in 1917. Like, you've got to do a few other things if that's what you want to accomplish.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are definitely parts of the manifesto that like, I don't know, probably wouldn't go over very well in 1917 in Russia or something. Like, for example, right after those 10 points about like what the most advanced countries should do, which I mean, of which like Russia in 1917 was like probably not one of them. But like right after that part, Marx has this whole kind of really weird thing about the state. And basically what he says is like, if the proletariat are able to sort of seize power, then like after a while the state should just kind of wither away. And like that's like a really wild idea that you wouldn't usually kind of attribute to Marx in this sort of like Bolshevik sense. Like, you know, the in the Soviet Union, like the last thing the state did was wither away, and that wasn't even like something that anyone would probably had prescribed. But it's like, it is definitely a hermeneutic project in the sense that like there are parts of Marx that will just go unread and like wouldn't have any kind of like feasible expression in actually existing socialism somewhere.
Yeah, at the very least, like what it would mean to have the state wither away in the Soviet Union is going to look different, for example, probably than what Marx thought it should look like. And
yeah,
there's
absolutely.
like nothing wrong with that. Like, it's fine. That's just part of the interpretive project, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think so.
But
I guess, but just recognizing that there is an interpretive project seems like a big deal to me.
Yes, exactly. Okay, well, let's maybe talk a little bit about more of like the history that Marx himself is situated in, and Engels, I guess, with respect to kind of pre-Marxian socialism. Before we sort of start making the leap to talking maybe a little bit more about contemporary communism. So, like we've done in these kind of past episodes, we've been noting that, you know, Marx and Engels didn't invent communism per se, and they don't even say that they did, right? They go out of their way to try to show that they think there's a long lineage that they're participating in. So Hobsbawm says in a chapter on this very sort of topic, at least on the like immediate predecessors of Marx and Engels, that they were latecomers to communism, historically. And I think that's really interesting because a lot of people associate Marx and Engels with, you know, the birth of communism or something like that. But there's actually a lot of other stuff going on there. Was there anything that specifically kind of jumped out at you there, Matt?
A lot. I mean, this is the part where there are the, 30 different French and German guys who Marx and Engels disagree with. There's a lot of other stuff too, though, that's kind of interesting. Here's a passage from Hobsbawm that is interesting to us specifically. He says, though some 18th century philosophers were engaged in modifying such traditions to fit with the new aspirations of liberal individual society, philosophy carried with it from the past a strong heritage of communalism, or even in several cases the belief that a society without private property was in some sense more, quote, natural, or at any rate historically prior to one with private property. And then he goes on to say the interesting thing, which is, there was even more marked in Christian ideology. Nothing is easier than to see the Christ of the Sermon on the Mount as the first socialist or communist. And though the majority of early socialist theorists were not Christians, many later members of socialist movements have found this reflection useful. There you go. That's like what we've been saying this whole time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's so much going on there that's really useful, I think. And what's cool about what Hobsbawm is doing is he kind of does he like gives something and then he kind of takes it away. That's sort of his argumentative strategy, I think, in many of his essays. And in this case, what he gives is that, yeah, there were these precursors to communism, and socialists have found ways to use that argumentatively in a way that makes a lot of sense. People who listen to this podcast should find that pretty obvious. But what he immediately kind of takes that away, I think, also, because he goes on to say that in many ways, trying to stress this link between these early kind of pre-Marxian communists and Marxist communism is problematic because the links are kind of forced in a certain way. Or at least it's like Marx and Engels and post-Marxist communists are inventing ancestors for themselves. So like he says, communists tried to find all these different lineages in ancient Greeks or in Christians or in like certain Enlightenment theorists like Rousseau or others. And Hobsbawm says like that's kind of disingenuous, but it does articulate a belief in progress at the heart of 19th century communism in general. So what you kind of learn from Hobsbawm's consideration of these long strands is that while there are continuities in some ways, there's also like really important discontinuities. And those are where the really interesting things, I think, start to happen, is like what is sort of unique about Marxist communism. And that's where he starts arguing with all of the French and German folks.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Helpful thing to do. A helpful way to sort of delineate Marx from the others. Yeah, I don't know, Dean. What were the most interesting things that made Marx different from the other, 19th century?
Yeah.
Folks?
I mean, so Marx goes out of his way to argue with a lot of them and articulate those differences. But I think that maybe two of the kind of more interesting things that I found, one was just the historical conditions that Marx is writing out of. So he's writing out of a situation where a proletarian movement is becoming more and more self-conscious and self-aware, and that's something that just simply wasn't available to communists before that time, because there wasn't as developed of a proletariat before that. So Marx is writing with like the French Revolution kind of in mind, and all kinds of other revolutionary energies where people are starting to think even harder about how to throw off feudalism than they already were. So I think that's like a really important point, right? That one reason that the proletariat is important to Marx is because they provide a revolutionary energy and they're analytically important, but they're also like around. So that's a really important kind of point. I think the second is just trying to articulate what communism and socialism meant as just sort of descriptive rhetorical terms for Marx and for like Marx's social milieu. So there's this great line where he says, Hobsbawm writes, unlike the word communist, which always signified a program, the word socialist was primarily analytical and critical. It was used to describe those who held a particular view of human nature, for example, the fundamental importance of sociability or the social instincts, which implied a particular view of human society, or to describe those who believed in the possibility or necessity of a particular mode of social action. So basically, these sound like really pedantic points, and in some ways they are, but they're also really important because Marx sided with the communists, right? The ones who had a program. Over and against the socialists, who were primarily analytical and critical, which is also kind of an interesting point since Marx is so analytical and critical himself.
Yeah, exactly. It's also kind of an interesting thing to think about, too. I think in the United States, at this point in history, like I said earlier, 2018, the year of our Lord, I don't know why I keep saying that. It just seems
it's just
like,
true.
relevant to differentiate. It's just true. What can I do? Like, I think more people now would identify as a socialist than a communist, which I think is kind of a bummer. But like the word socialist does not mean, I guess, what it used to even. Like, the word socialist was primarily an analytical or critical kind of viewpoint. Does not seem to be the case anymore. Socialists are people who, like, I don't know, like it's more of like a popular movement that like, desires a certain set of political goals without much of an analysis. Whereas people who identify as communists these days seem more critical, more analytical, and also have programs. So communists just seem better, huh?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. I mean, it is crazy that, like, okay, so it's good that people think that socialism is a good word now.
Yeah, for sure.
But the rapid uptake of that very word has, I think, importantly kind of watered down a lot of the analytical and critical sides of what it would mean to be a socialism, right? Like, people are arguing about, like, what's democratic socialism? What does it mean to be a democratic socialist, for example? You have people like Bernie Sanders, who is, like, a critical guy in some ways, but in other ways, like, completely not critical.
Yeah.
Like, really, really bad at talking about American foreign policy, like, for some reason wants to, like, extradite Assata Shakur from Cuba. Like, not the kind of thing that you would do if you were an analytical and critical socialist, I don't think.
Yeah.
At least one that kind of deserves those terms.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's wild. Like, I don't know. I don't want to be overly mean to, like, people within like the sort of democratic socialist discourse, but it's a thing that people are working out still, I guess.
Yeah, and it's not to say there aren't people who are democratic socialists who are, like, smart.
Yeah,
there are plenty
totally.
of them. But, like, just denoting sort of movements or whatever, it is kind of funny that there's a historical switch here in some ways. I don't really know the details of that, but I don't know. That's a good insight anyway.
Yeah, I think so. Weird thing.
It is weird. All right, so we've got a little bit on the table about, like, Marx's historical context and what's going on there, and you can read, if you really want to know, all the scholastic debates that he has with all kinds of people that, I don't know, aren't that relevant to my brain. But I think that is a good way to maybe transition into some of the kind of specifically Marxist theories of, like, strategy, and maybe specifically we could talk a bit about the state, because I think that, like, I don't know, that's a thing that obviously comes up a lot with Marxists and Marxism. What do you do about the state? What's a Marxist state look like? Even like when we had our first episode with Catherine from Friendly Anarchism, that was like the sticking point, right? Like, we can be nice to each other for a long time, but, like, eventually we got to talk about the state. So let's do a little bit of that. There's a great chapter, I think probably my favorite one of the ones we read, called Marx, Engels, and Politics. And it kind of just discusses what Marx and Engels thought about political strategy in relationship to the situation on the ground that they were part of. So yeah, I don't know, Matt, any hot takes about the Marxist theory of the state from the reading, or just your general Marxist disposition?
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of kind of interesting things going on with the state and the dictatorship of the proletariat. Great term that for some reason just doesn't go over very well these days. Anyways, one part that kind of sticks out to me is this quote. I'll just read it here. Hobsbawm says this: "The early communist form of Marxist theory of the state sketched out 4 main points. The essence of the state was political power, which was the official expression of the opposition of classes within bourgeois society. It would consequently cease to exist in communist society. In the present system, it represented not a general interest of society, but the interest of the ruling classes. Both a revolutionary victory of the proletariat, it would, during the expected transition period, not disappear immediately, but take the temporary form of the proletariat organized as ruling class, or the dictatorship of the proletariat." Okay, so there's like a bunch of different options from Marxist theory about the state. There's a lot of different ones going on. I just mentioned a few minutes ago the withering state, and in these 4 options, that's definitely one of them. But it gives you a few different ideas of ways Marx thought about it. But
I think they're not 4 options per se, so much as 4 kind of interconnected points, which
yeah.
I think is a really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, we'll say more about that then, Dean.
So, right, the essence of the state is political power, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is true for Marx. But it would, so he says, it would cease to exist in a communist society. So those are like some important kind of issues, right? Because on the one hand, he wants to say that it's political power, and that's also why he thinks that you need one, right? Like, you have to take that political power in order to shift to a different kind of social situation. But once you're in a different social situation, hopefully that political power can go away, because you don't need it to ward off the possibilities of the ruling class of the proletariat being kind of re-dethroned, I guess, or dethroned after its own revolution by the bourgeoisie. So in that sense, like, I think it's important to recognize that Marx thinks that the state is necessary for certain purposes, and that there are certain qualities that the state has that are available to it strategically that make sense in certain times, and then hopefully wouldn't need to be present in other times.
Yeah, no, totally, that's right. So the essence of the state was political power, and what that, like, the way that shakes out is just like the sort of historical situation kind of denotes the way that like state power has to be used, right?
Right.
So, I mean, I guess like the kind of cool thing about Marx is that, like, whenever you don't know the answer to like how something will actually look, you say, well, depends on the historical conditions, and
yeah.
Same thing here.
I think too that when we talk about the state, especially with Marx, we always have to talk about the Paris Commune and what I think the character of that meant for what it means to talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat. So there's a really interesting kind of block quote that I'll read here, where Hobsbawm articulates some, I think, like, important reminders. So he says, as is well known, the experience of the Paris Commune suggested important amplifications to Marx's and Engels' thoughts on the state and the proletarian dictatorship. The old state machinery could not be simply taken over, but had to be eliminated. Marx here seems to have thought primarily of Napoleon III's centralized bureaucracy as well as army and police. The working class had to secure itself against its own representatives and officials in order to avoid the transformation of the state and state organs from servants of society into its masters, as had happened in all previous states. Though this change has been interpreted in subsequent Marxist discussion chiefly as the need to safeguard the revolution against the dangers of the surviving old state machinery, the danger envisaged applies to any state machinery which is allowed to establish autonomous authority, including that of the revolution itself. The resulting system discussed by Marx in connection with the Paris Commune has been the subject of intensive debate ever since. Little about it is unambiguously clear, except that it is to consist of responsible elected servants of society and not of a corporation standing above society. So I think that helps to do away with a lot of some of the caricatures that some people worry about with respect to Marxist theories of the state, and also some, I don't know the right adjective, but maybe like adolescent or kind of immature defenses of the state, just for the sake of like defending the state that you sometimes get among communists.
Yeah.
Like, it's just important to realize that, like, the state isn't just good because it's the state. And there are, like, lots of ways that the state should and should not look that Marx and Engels both kind of thought about.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's good. It actually, I'll say more about the Paris Commune in 1 second, but it does kind of remind me of this thing Foucault said once about prisons. I think we've said this in the show before, but who knows? There's this, like, pretty cool interview in a book, I don't know, with Foucault. And there's, like, this interviewer who's like, well, like, what should prisoners do? Like, should they take over a prison? And he's like, yeah, they should totally take over a prison. And then he's like, but, you know, a prison's, like, great, but, like, they should also, like, take it apart after they take it over. And I think you can interpret that in, like, a really sort of, like, anarchist way. And that's fine. Do that. That's a good hermeneutic project. Why not? But there's also something kind of Marxist about it too, in the same way, where it's like you see sort of like the state apparatus, and now you have to figure out what to do with it. So, like, don't let it, don't let the sort of, like, old form for whatever reason creep back up.
Yeah.
More on that. I guess anyways, getting back to the phrase, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and, like, what that means. I guess it's, like, a really scary word because dictatorship's in it, and that's, like, one of those ways that, like, anti-communist forces really capitalize on that rhetoric to kind of turn it against Marxists and communists in general. But there's another kind of interesting note from Hobsbawm that says the only regime actually described by Marx as a dictatorship of the proletariat was the Paris Commune. So think about that for a second. That gives a little bit more like texture to, like, what that word might mean. A dictatorship is probably not the first kind of thing that one might associate with the Paris Commune.
Right.
But it kind of tells you a little bit more about, like, what he thinks about that kind of idea. Later in that same kind of passage, he says, an army of the proletariat was the precondition of its dictatorship. So there's a lot of ideas kind of going on there in terms of, like self-determination of people and the organization of proletarians in a particular order against capital. Huh?
Right. Yeah, and I think it's funny, too, in that same kind of general passage, Hobsbawm draws out that the political characteristics of the Paris Commune that Marx emphasized were the opposite of dictatorial in the literal sense. He says Engels cited both the Democratic Republic as its specific political form and the Paris Commune. However, since neither Marx nor Engels set out to construct a universally applicable model of the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat or predict all situations in which it might be enforced, we can conclude no more from their observations than it ought to combine the democratic transformation of the political life of the masses with measures to prevent counter-revolution by the defeated ruling class. I think that is just kind of a also, like, important thing to keep in mind. The, like, dictatorship of the proletariat, the specific qualities that they do kind of pull out aren't the kind of things that we associate it with, like, dictatorships today, I guess, just as, like, a common rhetorical term.
Yeah, well, I mean, since, like, okay, so if the state is political power, then, like, what it means to have a dictatorship of the proletariat is that proletarians are the people who can exercise political power.
Right.
And, like, that doesn't mean bad. It doesn't mean that that's, like, in a bad way.
Yeah, it doesn't mean bad.
It could be good, even.
Yeah, it doesn't mean bad. It does mean good.
Yeah.
All right. Maybe we can start kind of rounding this around by talking about the Communist Manifesto essay, the one that you both like and don't like. I think probably one of my favorite observations that Hobsbawm makes about the historical situation that the manifesto is part of is that the rhetorical force of the document outlives, like, the usefulness of it. I think that's actually very funny. So, like, Marx and Engels write it, and they write it, for the Communist League or whatever, and then they release it out into the world, and, like, I think the common assumption is, like, yeah, and then, like, people got it, and they got hold of it, and it, like, changed everything. But actually, like, it didn't really get, like, picked up very quickly, and then by the time it did, it, like, started really going around the world and, like, getting translated and getting used. Marx and Engels, like, noted several times in its republication that it just kind of got, like, outdated. But they couldn't, I mean, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Like, they said what they said, and there it is. And I think that's so kind of fascinating that there's a real, like, I don't know, like force behind the writing that outlives even the hopes or aspirations of the people who wrote it.
Dean, there you go, getting all postmodern again there, dude. That's, I think, the death of the author right there, actually.
That's right. What can I say? I've been educated by Duridians. It's just how it is.
I mean, it's also good, like, whatever. I don't know. I don't have any problem with postmodernism. Just making a joke for the podcast. Yeah, it is like really funny. I mean, just think about how many jokes on Twitter today you've seen about like specters haunting Europe or whatever.
I made one like 2 days ago.
The rhetoric is too good. It's too good. That was their problem. They wrote something that was too good. That's my official stance on the Communist Manifesto, is that it's the best and it's too good for everyone else.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, like, the first time I ever read it, I was, in college or whatever, and I like immediately loved it. It's like such a cool piece. Rhetorically, it's super strong, and Hobsbawm at one point says it has an almost biblical force, and like, yeah, it's very good. If you read it all the way through, you should feel kind of convicted and like let's break these chains. Let's get at it. Let's centralize that credit. I'd love to.
Yeah, all those people who are really interested in banking practices just get really fired up by it for sure.
This guy, he says centralize the credit. What? That was my first response.
This manifesto's got some good ideas. I think that's all right. Let's talk a little bit about what is in the manifesto. I don't know, maybe someday we should actually do an episode on the manifesto itself, but let's try to avoid that a little bit by maybe just pulling out a couple things Hobsbawm says about how the manifesto gets like misinterpreted and what he sort of keys in on. I don't know, anything that really stuck out to you in that chapter?
Yeah, one thing that Hobsbawm says that's kind of interesting about sort of misinterpretations is this. He says, contrary to widespread assumptions, inasmuch as it believes that historical change proceeds through humans making their own history, the manifesto is not a determinist document. The graves have to be dug by or through human action. Yeah, so some people read the Communist Manifesto. Some people kind of interpret Marx in that weird lens where, like, this is just the thing that happens next. Like, it, I mean, like, sometimes you'll hear people say that, like, capitalism sort of sows its own seeds of revolution or whatever. I don't know how the phrase actually goes. But you hear people say that kind of stuff, that, like, it's capitalism creates the conditions of its own overthrow, which is true, but not in, like, sort of a mechanic way, but in the sense that it actually makes the lives of people very bad, and the lives of those people have agency, and they can, like, do things to, make capitalism go away. Anyways, really eloquent over here tonight. But anyways, yeah, so it's Hobsbawm's note that it's not a determinist document is one that's good, because people get kind of confused about that sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's good too. Like, the proletariat is a force that's brought into being by capitalism for sure, but you have to organize it to make it take power. Like, I don't think Marx and Engels assume that, the proletariat is just gonna like everybody's gonna wake up and then look around and be like, wow, our lives really are kind of bad, actually. That's why we ought to be communists. Like, clearly that is not how it works and not how it has worked. You have to, like, really help people kind of learn how to advocate for themselves, advocate for each other. And that is the challenge, I think, of, digging the grave for capitalism, like becoming the grave digger, is not just assuming that, like, they're all going to pop up and kind of, I don't know, inevitably, like, change the system or something.
Yeah, that's a really helpful articulation of it, I think. Okay, so, like, capitalism does sort of, like, proletarianize a workforce, right? Like, that's a thing that happens. Like, they own,
for sure,
they come to own nothing but their labor, and that's all they can sell, and so on. And like, the proletariat is sort of, like, formed as a class. But that's, like, the proletariat being formed as a class is, like, different than that class being organized against capitalism, or, like, that class actually just being communist or something, right? Like, I remember Richard Gilman-Polsky, my dude, my second favorite person next to Marx. He, like, one time he said, like, the point of being a communist is that, like, you can kind of, like, like at some kind of crucial point in history, you could like nudge people in the right direction, right? And that nudging is important because people have agency. People, like, the masses can do things, and you got to get them to do those things to help you, and you help them to get capitalism in the ground. In the grave.
Also, why you should go see Sorry to Bother You.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I know we're kind of like rounding out to the end here. I don't know. This is sort of a meandering conversation, but hopefully it's good. I do, though, want to give you a chance, Matt, to raise this grievance that you have with this chapter at the end of it.
Yeah. I've got nothing but grievances. Like I said, that's kind of the point. Yeah, so I mentioned a few bad takes that Hobsbawm has, and here's one more. So at the very end of the section about the Communist Manifesto, he says this thing that I don't like. The commitment to politics is what historically distinguished Marxian socialism from the anarchists, and from the successors of those socialists whose rejection of all political action the manifesto specifically condemns. Even before Lenin, Marxian theory was not just about what history shows us will happen, but also about what must be done. So that's true, I think. Like, well, okay, hang on. No, let me qualify that. It is true that Marxism is a political philosophy about action. Like, the point is not to, describe the world, but change it. That's the thing that Marx is all about, right? But I think it's like disingenuous to say that like that's what historically distinguished Marxian socialism from anarchists or from other like socialists. Like, that can't be true.
Yeah.
Especially if like what we just said. Especially if Marx's take that we just covered about the Paris Commune is true. Like, they were not Marxists, or like that's not how that worked.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So, like, it is true that, like, Marxism is a political philosophy about action, about doing things, and, like, that's totally true. But it's kind of a problem to just say that no one else did things, because that's dumb. That's a bad take.
Yeah, I think you're right. No doubt about that. It's also just a sort of irrelevant, like, sectarian point, which is somewhat ironic because Hobsbawm goes out of his way to talk about how Marx was pretty intentionally non-sectarian and, like, advocated communists not throwing stones, but just, like, trying to embed themselves into a number of different movements because they could be good.
Yeah. So, on this point, either Hobsbawm has a bad take or we're just misunderstanding what he's talking about. You never know.
Yeah, could be. You never really do know. All right, so let's wrap up a little bit. What do we learn about communism from Marx that we don't get from pre-Marxist communist Christians that we talked about? I think there's a lot of stuff we didn't talk about on this episode. Like, okay, Marx has a lot of specific ideas about what capitalism is, what it does, how it operates, all that kind of stuff. And that's an important conversation to have. But apart from that, Matt, what do you think, sort of based on some of these political ideas we get from Marx in particular?
I think the most important idea that we get from Marx in particular, that we maybe don't get as much from the other folks we've talked about in the past weeks, is that, like, organizing people is important. That seems like a dumb thing to even have to draw out, but actually, no, it's true.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. It's not the kind of thing that you get with, like, a communism of consumption. Like, you would organize within your community, but it's not really, I don't know. It's not about, like, going out into the world and, like, organizing everybody else necessarily. Maybe like, Mutzer or, like, the Diggers have something like that in there, but not nearly the same.
Yeah, not nearly the same because, like, I mean, the Diggers, okay, let's take them as an example for a second. They organized people for sure. Their organization was like, hey, you see that hill out there? We're going to go plant stuff on it. And then everyone else surrounding them was like, okay, and we're going to send soldiers to beat you up or something. So I guess, like, organizing people is important, and organizing people in the form of the state is also pretty important too. Something that's kind of missing from the, communism of consumption, or maybe some of the radical Christians we've talked about, that they just, like, don't ever kind of go that far.
I think maybe Mutzer could potentially have gone that far. You do get this sort of sense that, like, he was going to institute, like, a weird peasants' commune, not unlike the Paris Commune. But obviously, like, that didn't pan out because he died. And also, I think that like the insistence on a kind of theological bent is fine, but it does preclude you from some like important questions and strategies. Like the materialism that's present in Marxism is actually really helpful. Like, people should focus on the fact that like some people have a lot of stuff and other people don't have a lot of stuff, not necessarily just because like the Bible thinks that that's bad or something, but because like it is demonstrably bad when you just like look around you. Like, you shouldn't really need like a theological justification to be upset about that. Like, if you have one, that's fine, I guess. But also, I don't know, like, you can be an atheist and be pissed off that like some people die and Jeff Bezos wants to go to space. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's good that within the Bible, within Christian tradition, we have people that say material goods are, disproportionately allocated to people.
Yeah.
But that doesn't go quite far enough. Like, it doesn't go quite far enough because we have, like, in Christianity, weird conversations about it still. Like, oh, well, the rich young ruler not being able to enter heaven actually doesn't have anything to do with how much wealth he has. It actually has to do with the way he can't humble himself before God, or, like, whatever, right?
Right.
So it's like we Christians miss the point, and the materialist analysis means that you don't miss the point.
Yep, I think so. And I think also maybe one kind of takeaway, at least from the Hobsbawm stuff for me, is something that Marx can help Christians think about is like really boring problems, like the state or the proletariat, or like how do you recognize the situation around you. Those are just things that Christians, I think, are not great at thinking about, in part because they have reasons to be like anxious about it. Like, it's not accidental that a lot of Christians are attracted to anarchism, for example, and not attracted to Marxism when they start having kind of like an anti-capitalist awakening. I mean, that was my own situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's just good to have those kinds of analyses that you get from Marx.
Yeah, because otherwise you end up being a Christian anarchist who like thinks the state is absolutely bad because it's coercive, but like, you also think that like like Jacques Ellul, like, no one should come vaccinate your cows.
Right. Those cows.
They always need vaccinating. The thing about cows,
Yeah. I think that thinking about the Marxist cow farmer is really the next horizon for Christian leftists at this point.
Okay, so if you're playing the Magnificast home game, these are the things that you should learn from Marx. You're not going to learn from other people. Organizing people is important. You got to have an analysis of capitalism and its actual production. You have to think about boring problems like the state and central banking and the proletariat. Materialism is actually good. And then the last one is Marx gives us good questions. So Jose Miranda, like we talked about last week, is kind of an interesting guy. He kind of points out some really good things about the Bible and about communism in the Bible and capitalism in the Bible. There isn't capitalism in the Bible, but there is communism. Gotta think about it. Okay, so he says, kind of turning back to the beginning of the episode, he says, for a Christian to say that he or she is anti-Marxist is understandable. But to be anti-communist is quite a different matter. And I think that is true, right? For a Christian to say that he or she is anti-Marxist, I get it. Like, I get why Marx might make Christians kind of, like, feel weird.
It's a bad brand.
A bad brand. But if you actually read Marx, he's good. Wolf Howl.
Yeah, Wolf Howl. Wolf Howl indeed.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard on this episode, and, you did, you can give us some money on Patreon, patreon.com/themagnificast. You can also follow us on Twitter, twitter.com/themagnificast, @themagnificast. I don't know how Twitter works. We also have a cool Facebook group called the Magnificast Basement. You can join it and see the articles that people post about fun and interesting things. Lots of good stuff going on there. Cool. We're also on 2 podcast networks that I just remembered that we haven't really posted to in a while. Probably got to fix that. The networks are called Theology Corner and Critical Mediations, and they're both extremely good with all kinds of other good podcasts like Friendly Anarchism, Revolutionary Left Radio, Delete Your Account. I don't know, lots of other good people doing good stuff. Listen to them all. Yep, cool. So music is also done by Amari Armstrong, and the outro music is done by The Illogical Spoon. Cool. See you next week.
Gonna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up.